Step 7, humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings. Step 7 requires humility and courage. Back in step 6, we realized that many of the character defects that gave rise to our eating disorders persisted long after we had become willing to let them go. It's humbling to recognize that we can no more will ourselves to be free of self-centeredness or the vulnerability to pain and misery that it causes than we can will ourselves to be free of our eating disorders. Our main concern now should be how we can get out of our own way so we can turn our attention to what matters in the long run: service to the greater good, our God, higher power, our purpose. This is exactly where our sponsors step in to help us identify character building activities that help open us up to new experiences. We find we can leverage the pain of our defects to good purpose, replacing old patterns of thought and behavior with meaningful action. So I think that step 7, really to highlight, speaks to working with a sponsor, working with someone that can help you see the illumination, the lemonade out of the lemons in the character defects. I think that in step 6, I know when I was working with my sponsee on this most recently, she was like, oh my gosh, I feel so dark, heavy, dirty from going in step 6 and looking at, okay, I am a perfectionist, I procrastinate, I am an all or nothing thinking, I am compulsive, I am intense, just sharing a little bit about mine. But to have someone say to you, okay, well, your perfectionism, what can you do as a character building exercise that counter 2 of your most significant character defects? So for example, I had someone look at my step 6 and looked at all of my character defects. And she said to me, okay, you're a perfectionist. Well, you're driven. Okay, you procrastinate. Well, you're slow and steady and you're thoughtful. Okay, you have a fear of letting go. Well, that's thoughtful and smart. Okay, you're compulsive, but you're also proficient and determined. And it really, really takes, for me, it was helpful to have someone else help me with my character building exercises that spoke to my defects because I felt very defective in them. Sure.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely helpful to have that outside perspective because a lot of times, and like you say with a lot of the steps, like don't get stuck there. Don't get stuck on step 6 where you're tearing yourself down. That's not the purpose of the exercise. The purpose is to bring to light things that I feel like with step 6, a lot of those things were in the back of my mind and they have more power when I'm not putting words to them a lot of times. When I write it down on paper and can say, oh yeah, I procrastinate, or I'm a perfectionist, or, something like that, something about it, putting it down on paper is, makes it more real, but it also makes it a little bit more accessible. Like, okay, we did that. Now what can we do moving forward? How can we see the bright side of things? And I do think it's that careful balance of not saying, oh, I'm not a perfectionist. I just, so I think it helps to have that outside person as well give that piece. Does that kind of make sense?
It does. I very much agree to that. And like when we let go of the defects, we can strengthen our character. And so I think that
I guess one of the things I'm murky on, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit, is if we're reframing defects, are we letting go of them?
It's interesting, and we were talking about this earlier. We had a meeting tonight, and we were looking at step 4, and we were talking about this. And I get what you're saying. Like, is it an excuse?
Right.
And it is a fine line. And so I think that. So here, let me share the 7-step prayer. Maybe this will answer the question because I'm sure this is coming up for a lot of us. So I'm going to read the 7-step prayer that really speaks to the spiritually inclined, and know that, of course, in EDA there's an alternative step prayer. But my Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character that stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your building. Amen.
So yes. So what stands out is the defects that are preventing me from moving forward in your will.
Yes.
So that's the piece of it. It's not the black and the white.
Right.
It's those perfectionist tendencies, when used toward planning something for the service of others, can be a positive, as long as it's moving towards something good outside of yourself.
Yeah, and I underlined this too. I'm in step 7 here in the big book on page 176. Reflection is a useful tool, but rumination can lead us to lose sight of the bigger picture. We call that self-centered fear. Loss of what we already have or hope to have seems to be at the root of our defects. So rather than continuing to focus on ourselves, our main concern should now be how we can get out of our own way so we can turn our attention to what matters in the long run.
Well, that's interesting too, because I feel like, I know for myself personally, I will sometimes, some of these things that we listed in step 6 as character defects, I almost embodied as, this is who I am. Like, I'm taking these on to make up, to give myself some self identity.
Like definition?
Yeah. Like, I want to fit into, I'm something, so yes, it's a defect, but that makes me who I am. Because it feels scarier to be fluid.
Yeah.
It feels scarier to be outside of
not defined
myself.
Black and white, right?
Yeah.
Well, and for me, it's been so much of my character, what's the word? Like foundation, like makeup, like design, all that stuff. It feels scary to not have them,
Yeah.
Well,
You've been telling yourself, this is who I am.
That's who I am. That's who I am. That's who I'm illustrated by. Right. Another thing that with the character building activities that speaks to your question, I think we can find leverage. We find we can leverage the pain of our defects to good purpose, replacing old patterns of thought and behavior with meaningful action. If we were prideful, we can work to create capabilities in others. If we were manipulative, we can have empathy for those who demand that others conform to their will. If we were silent victims, we can work to find our voice. If we were greedy for attention, we can share our time with those less fortunate. So I think it's cool to see how those character defects can be still in us and yet put to good work, right? Like,
oh yeah, 100%. And you're just able to relate to it from a very personal place, like a place of I've been there. I get it.
Yeah.
And I understand that you being there isn't helpful to your health and happiness. Like, this isn't coming from a judgmental perspective, just like, you leading an EDA group, you've been there, and you're not leading it to fix everybody. You're leading it because you were there and it was rough, and you want people to come out to the other side.
Yeah, I think it's humility, is a big piece too, and I think it's admitting that there's pieces of us that work and that don't, and by humbling, asking God to remove our shortcomings, it's another step, sort of like step 1. I mean, it's admitting something else and asking God to take it away, and
it's not a one-time thing.
No, it's
just like we say over and over again,
in, right?
And something else might pop up, and then we can work through that.
And I wrote that, I underlined this too on page 173. Before taking step 7, we will want to consider what humility really means. So I'm going to speak to humility for a second. When we first worked the steps, many of us mistakenly thought of humility as something more closely aligned with humiliation than with dignity, peace, and power. We may have found the idea distasteful or even distressing. Our lives, this is the part that I underlined, our lives up to this point have been all about striving, achieving something for ourselves, vying for validation, attention, and love, earning respect and reward. Most of us believe that the purpose of life was tied up with personal achievement. And I completely resonate with that. My worth was determined by external circumstances. And so with humility, we are not called upon to defend our ideas or positions. We are much less likely to offend or take offense.
Yeah.
Just a modest view of our importance. And one cannot build a meaningful life on the basis of self-satisfaction alone.
Yeah.
And so being for others, and we did something at church one time where we talked about what our gifts from God were, and I think that, yeah, I do have a gift from God to be a perfectionist. Like, all jokes aside, like, I do have a gift from God to be an all or nothing thinker, and how can I build my character by getting out of my own way and build things up versus pull things down? And so I see in the big book that it does encourage us to move on to step 8 as soon as possible, and that they share that if you're still at high risk of returning to old patterns of thinking until you've worked all the steps. So to keep going, not thinking that just because you work step 7 and that you're looking at how your character building activities are going to help you, to keep going. And they recommend writing down any form of the 7th step prayer or statement that feels right to us so we can read it aloud throughout the day. And so the alternative 7th step prayer, I'll just read since I read the other one. I recognize and accept that I have been living with many self-oriented concerns and issues that have held me back from cheerful service to the greater good. I'm smiling right now, cheerful. I now let go of worry about my shortcomings and choose to focus instead on serving effectively and well. I trust that as I focus more on my service than my issues, the shortcomings that stand in the way of my usefulness will diminish, and the authenticity, integrity, dedication, and skills that my service requires will grow stronger. My daily follow-through on my commitment to serve will become my strength instead of the defects of character.
Yep.
So letting go of defects, strengthening character, 7-step prayer, character building activities and exercises, looking at your step 6 with someone objectively to allow you to then ask God to help you humbly remove your shortcomings.
I love it. And where can they find some resources? If
They can find some resources on, of course, in the EDA Big Book and at eatingdisordersanonymous.org. Keep coming back. It works when you work it.
See ya.
Bye.